The airport buzzed with travelers hurrying to catch their flights, but for 7-year-old twins Malachi and Micah, this was the biggest day of their lives. Dressed in matching navy hoodies and slightly oversized jeans, the boys clutch each other's hands tightly as their aunt shouted at the airline staff about a last-minute cancellation. Their mother had died months ago, and this trip to America was supposed to be their fresh start until Auntie Lara's ticket got messed up. In a flurry of confusion and desperation, a kind airline worker quietly knelt down to speak to the boys. Minutes later, the boys were boarding the flight alone, seated in the last row, nervously staring at their seatbelts. Neither of them had flown before. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, a very different scene was unfolding. Vivian Brooks, heiress to a global tech empire, walked slowly and carefully, her hand resting protectively on her heavily pregnant belly. At 38 weeks, she was far too late in her pregnancy to be flying, but with her husband insisting they fly private, and her stubbornness saying otherwise, she'd opted for this commercial flight instead. A tight red maternity dress clung to her swollen figure, and her expression remained cold and composed, even as flight attendants whispered about her presence. Her husband, Nathan Brooks, followed behind, distracted by business calls and glancing disapprovingly at the seating arrangements. They were meant to sit in first class, but a last-minute booking glitch had bumped them to economy. He wasn't happy, but Vivian didn't care. She just wanted peace and something about being among regular people, especially on a journey that felt symbolic, felt right. She didn't know it yet, but by the end of that flight, it wouldn't be her husband or her fortune she'd be thinking about. It would be the 2 little boys at the back of the plane who would change everything. The plane hummed steadily as it climbed into the clouds, leaving Lagos behind. Malachi stared out the window with wide eyes, trying to pretend he wasn't scared, while Micah clutched his tiny backpack like it was a shield. The boys had been through too much for children their age losing their mother, moving from one relative's house to another, and now traveling to live with an uncle they barely remembered. The overhead announcement sounded like distant echoes, and though the flight attendant smiled at them kindly, no one really paid much attention to 2 small, quiet black boys seated at the very back of the plane. That is, until turbulence struck. The cabin lights flickered slightly, and the plane jerked. Passengers gasped. Malachi whimpered and grabbed Micah's hand. 3 rows ahead, Vivian groaned and shifted uncomfortably. At first she assumed the sharp twinge in her side was just the result of poor seating. But then it happened again, stronger, more sudden, and followed by a spreading warmth beneath her. Her water had broken. Nathan, sitting beside her, looked horrified, dropping his phone mid-call. He scrambled to call a flight attendant while Vivian gritted her teeth and let out a long breath, trying to stay calm. The noise stirred attention from nearby passengers. The once quiet flight was now a blur of murmurs, buzzing call buttons, and frantic foot traffic in the narrow aisle. A male attendant ran to the cockpit while another knelt beside Vivian, asking how far along she was. Her reply was curt but clear, too far to ignore. And just like that, a whisper spread through the cabin. She's in labor. Yet in all the chaos and panicked shuffling, no one noticed the 2 little boys quietly unbuckling their seatbelts. Something about the way the woman had cried out drew them forward, not out of curiosity, but something else. Something deeper. Something they didn't understand yet. Vivian leaned back, her breath coming in quick, shallow waves. The pain was increasing rapidly, and her dress was soaked. Her husband hovered helplessly, shouting for the flight attendants to do something, but offering no comfort. The attendants whispered frantically among themselves there was no doctor on board, only a nurse who admitted she hadn't delivered a baby in years. Tension thickened in the air. A woman in a nearby row offered ice chips. Someone else tried playing calming music from their phone, but none of it eased the truth. This baby was coming now, whether they were ready or not. In the very back, Malachi stood first, eyes wide but steady. Micah followed without hesitation. As they walked slowly down the aisle, passengers glanced at them, puzzled. 1 or 2 people tried to stop them, assuming they were just lost or confused. But something in their faces, the quiet calm, the seriousness made even the skeptical passengers step aside. They reached the row where Vivian lay slumped and groaning, her face contorted in pain. Nathan barely noticed them at first until Malachi gently touched his arm. He turned, irritated. "She needs to lie back more," Malachi said, voice surprisingly clear for a boy so small. Nathan blinked. "What?" "She's pushing wrong. My mummy did it too, before she died," Micah added softly, glancing at Vivian. For a brief moment, time stood still. Vivian's head turned toward them, and her tear-filled eyes met theirs. In that split second, something passed between them, an understanding, a memory. Loss recognizing loss, pain meeting compassion. She nodded weakly. The nurse looked down at the twins, confused. "Are you two trained or—" "No," Malachi said simply. "But we remember everything." And with that, the two boys got to work calmer than the grown men around them, more focused than anyone else in the room. Vivian's breathing steadied. For the first time since the ordeal began, someone in that plane seemed to know what to do. The nurse stepped aside, unsure whether to be alarmed or amazed. Micah unzipped his small backpack and pulled out a neatly folded towel they always carried just in case. Malachi helped ease Vivian's head into a better position with a firmness that stunned even her husband. Nathan watched with his mouth half open as these two little strangers took control of the moment, like they had done it 100 times. But what he didn't know, what no one on that plane could have guessed, was that the twins had watched their mother die giving birth to a baby who never cried. They had seen too much, lost too much, and remembered everything. Micah gently wiped Vivian's forehead as she cried through another contraction. He whispered to her, not as a nurse or a doctor would, but with the soft tone of a child who knew what pain felt like. "Don't be scared," he said. "Just push when it feels too big to keep inside." Vivian clung to those words. Nathan tried to say something, but for once, he was completely out of his depth. He had spent years in boardrooms making million-dollar decisions, yet here watching his wife give birth with two little boys guiding her, he was lost. As the contractions grew closer together, the tension on the plane shifted. Fear turned to focus. The passengers, once restless and annoyed, now watched in reverent silence. Some began to pray under their breath. Others clutched their seats, eyes glistening. A woman in the front began quietly filming, not for likes or fame, but because something sacred was unfolding. Vivian screamed as another wave hit, but Micah held her hand. "You're almost there," he whispered. "Like Mummy was," Malachi added, almost to himself. The nurse began to cry silently. She had never seen anything like it, not the birth, but the boys. Two little angels, forged in trauma, now bringing peace in the most unexpected place. The flight attendants had already informed the pilot, who in turn radioed the nearest airport for a possible emergency landing. But from the sound of things in row 31, there wouldn't be time. Vivian's cries grew louder, but they were no longer panicked, they were determined. Her legs trembled, her hands clutched the armrests, and her breathing followed Micah's rhythm, just as he softly instructed. She looked nothing like the perfectly poised billionaire heiress that tabloids loved to write about. In this moment, she was simply a woman fighting to bring life into the world. Nathan stood frozen behind the boys, his usual arrogance drained from his face. He wanted to help, but the only thing he could do was watch. His wife, his strong, fearless wife, was leaning on two boys he hadn't even noticed at boarding. People like them, he had assumed, didn't matter. Just another pair of unaccompanied minors, probably heading somewhere forgettable. But now they were saving his family, and he didn't even know their names. Around them, the cabin was utterly still. The passengers had turned their hearts toward the back of the plane. Some clasped their hands in silent prayer, others wiped away tears. One elderly woman whispered Psalm 91 under her breath. The noise of the engines was still there, but it faded into the background. Right now, this wasn't a flight, it was a sacred moment wrapped in metal and clouds. "Here comes the head," the nurse cried, finally stepping forward again. She gently guided Vivian through the next steps, but it was Micah who whispered, "It's okay, you're safe now." Vivian pushed with a scream that echoed through the plane, and then the cry. A baby's cry, loud, alive, full of life. Gasps filled the cabin. Applause erupted from the passengers. Some wept openly. Vivian collapsed back into the seat, exhausted but smiling. And Malachi, he simply stepped back, wide-eyed, as if hearing that baby cry had healed a part of him too. Vivian lay back, eyes closed, tears running down her face, but this time they weren't from pain. The newborn rested on her chest, tiny and wrinkled, breathing softly, alive and well. She had barely registered the flight attendant wrapping the baby in a clean airline blanket, or the nurse announcing it was a girl. All she could focus on was the cry, that beautiful, fragile cry that told her she had made it. She had brought life into the sky. And she hadn't done it alone. The boys stepped back quietly, their job seemingly done. Micah's hoodie sleeve was damp from wiping Vivian's sweat, and Malachi's hands were trembling slightly, but their faces stayed composed. Passengers began to whisper in awe, several people snapping photos not of the baby, but of the twins. Two little boys who had no reason to know what to do in such a moment, and yet somehow knew exactly how to do it. Nathan looked at them as if seeing them for the first time. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He crouched beside them slowly, clearing his throat. "What are your names?" he asked, voice cracking. "Malachi," the older twin said softly. "I'm Micah," the other whispered, eyes darting between Nathan and the baby. "Where are your parents?" The question made them glance at each other. "They're in heaven," Malachi answered without emotion, just quiet truth. Nathan's throat tightened. He turned to look at his wife, who was now cradling their baby girl with a trembling smile. He had never believed in signs or fate or anything deeper than numbers on a spreadsheet, but today had shaken something loose. These boys hadn't just helped deliver a baby, they had brought grace into the lives of everyone on board. And from that moment on, no one on that flight would ever see them as just two quiet kids at the back of a plane again. The plane continued to cruise through the skies, but inside, something had shifted. The cabin buzzed not with panic, but with reverence. Some passengers wept silently, others simply stared ahead in disbelief, still processing what they had just witnessed. The cries of the newborn had quieted now, replaced with soft coos as Vivian gently rocked her daughter. Her eyes kept drifting to the two little boys who stood just a few feet away, their backs straight, their expressions unreadable. Nathan sat across the aisle, watching everything. The guilt hit him harder now, not just for how helpless he had been during the birth, but for how invisible those boys had been to him until that moment. If they hadn't stepped forward, if they had stayed quiet in fear, Vivian and the baby might not have survived. And what did he offer in return? Nothing. Not even a seat upgrade or a second glance. Now he couldn't stop looking at them. Vivian whispered something to the baby, and then called softly, "Malachi." "Micah." Both boys turned. Her voice was softer now, motherly, filled with a gratitude that words couldn't fully express. "I want to name her after your mother," she said gently. "If you'd let me." Micah's lips parted slightly. He hadn't expected that. Malachi's eyes dropped to the floor, and for a second, it looked like neither of them would answer. Then Micah lifted his head. "Her name was Grace," he said, barely above a whisper. Vivian smiled, tears slipping again. "Grace it is." Gasps rippled through the passengers nearby who heard the exchange. A woman in the second row dabbed her eyes with a napkin. One man whispered, "God bless them," over and over like a prayer. The baby stirred gently as if acknowledging the name, and somewhere deep in the clouds, a moment of healing passed between two grieving boys and a woman who finally understood the power of grace. The pilot made an announcement. They would be landing at the nearest airport within the hour for medical assistance and safety checks. But his voice trembled slightly. Everyone could tell he had been informed of what had happened, and even he was moved. The flight attendants began checking rows again, though they lingered near the new mother and her baby longer than necessary, each one wanting to witness the miracle for themselves. Malachi and Micah returned to their seats at the back, not out of fear or awkwardness, but simply because no one had told them where else to go. They sat in silence, staring ahead, shoulders touching. They had done what needed to be done, just like they had when their mother collapsed months ago. Only this time, it hadn't ended in death. This time, someone had lived. Meanwhile, Vivian couldn't take her eyes off the boys. She had always believed herself strong. She had survived boardrooms filled with sharks, gossip columns, and a loveless childhood. But nothing had prepared her for this, the humility of being saved by two boys who had every reason to hate the world, but chose kindness instead. She held baby Grace closer and felt a strange ache in her chest. Not just gratitude, but guilt. How many like them had she overlooked in her life of privilege? Nathan had gotten up again and was speaking quietly to the head flight attendant. Papers were passed. A few nods exchanged. Then he approached the boys' row. "Hey," he said, kneeling this time. "I found your aunt's contact in the airline records. We'll call her when we land. But, if it's okay with you, we'd like to stay in touch." Micah blinked slowly, unsure how to respond. Malachi gave a small nod, and then said, "She's not mean. She just yells a lot." Nathan smiled. Understood. And just like that, two boys who boarded a plane as nobodies were now known by every soul in that cabin as heroes. When the wheels of the plane touched down at the emergency airport, the entire cabin exhaled together. It had only been a few hours since takeoff, but the emotional weight of what had happened made it feel like days. Flight attendants moved swiftly, coordinating with the medical team waiting on the ground. Passengers were told to remain seated so the mother and baby could be escorted off first. Vivian stood with help, clutching baby Grace gently in her arms. She paused for a long moment before exiting, scanning the rows. Her eyes landed on Malachi and Micah again. She gave a soft nod, the kind of thank you words could never carry. The boys simply nodded back, their faces calm, but something in their eyes shimmered, a quiet pride. The doors opened, and a round of spontaneous applause erupted from the passengers as Vivian stepped off the plane with her baby. Nathan followed, then paused halfway down the steps. He turned back toward the flight attendant and asked a final question, pointing to the back of the plane. She nodded, and he smiled faintly before stepping out into the sunlight. Inside the cabin, people began to whisper again, but this time, not in judgment or gossip. They whispered about them. The twins. The miracle. The strange peace that had blanketed the flight since they stood up. One woman turned and handed them a small chocolate bar. Another offered a toy from her son's backpack. Micah smiled shyly. Malachi just nodded with quiet thanks. When the boys finally disembarked, they didn't expect what they saw on the tarmac. A full medical team, yes, but also a small crowd of local press, alerted by the airline. And standing in front, still holding baby Grace, was Vivian. "Malachi? Micah," she called. The boys looked at each other, confused. Vivian gestured toward the cameras. "You saved her life. Let the world know who you are." They hesitated at first, but then, step by step, they walked forward, into the spotlight. And for the first time in a long while, they didn't feel like orphans anymore. The headlines spread fast. By the time the boys and the Brooks family reached the airport's private lounge, the story was already circulating online. "Twin boys deliver baby mid-flight, millionaire mom says they saved her life." News outlets from around the world picked it up. Photos of the twins, shy, wide-eyed, still in their worn hoodies, were being shared with captions like hearts of gold, "Young heroes in the sky," and "Angels in aisle 31. But for Malachi and Micah, none of that mattered. What mattered was that baby Grace was breathing. In the private lounge, Vivian sat on a plush white couch, Grace bundled up against her chest, while Nathan stood by with his phone buzzing non-stop. Reporters were calling, brands were offering sponsorships, and networks were already requesting interviews. But he ignored them for now. He had never felt this humbled in his entire life. All the deals, power, and money he had once clung to felt so small compared to the fragile baby in his wife's arms and the two little boys who had helped bring her into the world. Malachi and Micah sat quietly on the other couch, munching on snacks that had been laid out. They still hadn't fully grasped what was happening, only that people were being really, really nice, and no one had yelled at them in hours. It was a strange feeling. Vivian looked over at them, studying every detail, the quiet strength in Malachi's eyes, the gentle kindness in Micah's. She felt something deep and unexplainable stir inside her. These boys didn't just save her, they were meant to be part of her life somehow. Not for a headline, not for a favor, but for a reason she hadn't yet understood. She shifted Grace gently and said to her husband, "We can't let them go back to whatever life they came from." Nathan nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing." Outside the lounge, reporters were shouting for a quote. Inside, a new family was quietly forming, stitched together not by blood, but by something deeper. The lounge door opened again, and Auntie Lara finally arrived, out of breath, flustered and slightly annoyed. She had been redirected mid-transfer and had no idea what had happened on board the flight. All she knew was that two boys she was barely prepared to raise had somehow become the center of international attention. Her expression said it all when she spotted the cameras outside. Vivian stood to greet her, still holding Grace. "You must be their aunt," she asked calmly. Lara blinked, already defensive. "Yes, why?" Nathan stepped forward. "We just wanted to thank you and speak to you about something important." Micah instinctively sat up straighter, and Malachi's fingers curled slightly on the couch. They didn't trust easily, not after being passed around like boxes, not after sleeping on floors or going to bed hungry while grown-ups argued about whose turn it was to take them. Vivian continued gently, "Your nephews, they saved my life. And my daughters. We want to do more than just thank them. We'd like to sponsor them. Long term. Their education. Their health. And if you're open to it, we'd love to be part of their lives." Lara crossed her arms. "Sponsor? You mean adoption?" Vivian didn't flinch. "Only if you're willing. We know they're not ours. But something happened on that flight. Something we don't want to forget." The boys stared, stunned. Malachi's face remained unreadable, but Micah's eyes filled with confusion and something almost like hope. Lara sighed. "They're not bad boys. Just quiet. I was only meant to keep them for a while, but then their uncle never showed up. I don't want them to suffer, but I wasn't planning on all this." Vivian nodded. "Neither were we." For a long moment the room went quiet. Then Malachi whispered, "Would we still be together?" Vivian knelt in front of them. "Always. Both of you. Always together." And just like that, something shifted again. Not in the world outside, but in the boys' hearts, something that hadn't moved in a very long time. That night, the twins lay on a mattress in a small guest room inside a temporary holding suite arranged by the airline. Auntie Lara had chosen not to return to her shared apartment for now, overwhelmed by the attention and confused by the Brooks offer. The room was clean, comfortable even, but the twins couldn't sleep. They stared at the ceiling, the hum of the air conditioning steady in the background. Malachi lay with his hands folded behind his head, processing the day in silence. Micah had turned to face him, his voice barely a whisper when he finally said, "Do you think they mean it?" Malachi didn't answer at first. He had seen too many promises made by smiling adults that ended with shouting, slamming doors and sleeping on the floor. Their mother had trusted people too easily. One relative after another had said they'd help after she passed. None stayed. None followed through. Even Auntie Lara, as kind as she tried to be now, had once said in frustration that she didn't sign up to raise twins. So no, he didn't trust the word of strangers. But something about Vivian was different. She hadn't looked at them like a problem. She had looked at them like purpose. Micah continued speaking, more to himself now. She said, "Always together. What if they want just one of us? What if they change their mind like the others?" Malachi turned his head, meeting his brother's eyes. "Then we don't go," he said simply. "We stay together. Like always." It was a pact they had made the night their mother died in a clinic with no working generator, whispering to each other by candlelight after her final breath. Malachi had taken his baby brother's hand and promised, "No matter where we go together." Vivian and Nathan might have meant well, but the boys knew better than to hope too fast. Still, deep down, something inside them dared to wonder if this time just maybe things could be different. But trust wasn't something they could give overnight. It had to be earned, slowly, brick by brick. And so they waited in silence, listening to the quiet room, and wondering what tomorrow would bring. Morning light spilled into the lounge suite, soft and golden, catching the edge of the boys' tightly curled hair as they woke to the aroma of warm food. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't the sharp yell of an adult or the cold shuffle of moving from one place to another that stirred them, it was peace. Vivian had personally arranged breakfast for them, instructing hotel staff to serve the boys their favorites based on a brief chat she'd had with them the night before. Warm yam fries, boiled eggs, cocoa tea, and even a small plate of pancakes, things they hadn't seen since their mother passed. Micah's eyes lit up first, but he looked at Malachi, waiting for a sign that it was okay to eat. Malachi, the ever-careful one, inspected the table first. It looked real, smelled real. And somehow, it made him uneasy because nothing this good ever lasted. Vivian entered the room moments later, dressed casually with baby Grace wrapped in a soft sling against her chest. Her face was tired but kind. "Good morning, boys," she greeted warmly, taking a seat near them without formality. "Did you sleep well?" Micah nodded shyly while Malachi offered a non-committal shrug. Vivian didn't take offense. She understood. "I thought we could have breakfast together," she added, placing a bottle of milk in Grace's mouth as the baby suckled quietly. Nathan joined soon after, dressed down for once in a t-shirt and joggers, carrying 2 wrapped gift bags. "These are for you," he said, placing the bags on the table. Inside were 2 brand new tablets with educational games and access to children's books. But even more valuable was the handwritten note inside each. "You changed our lives. We want to be part of yours if you'll let us." Malachi stared at his unopened gift. He didn't move. But for the first time, Micah smiled and took a small bite of his pancake. Vivian noticed the change and said nothing. It was a beginning. Not trust yet, but a seed. And she knew better than to rush something as delicate as healing. Later that afternoon, Vivian invited the boys to take a walk with her through the private garden of the hotel resort. It was a small, enclosed space with neatly trimmed hedges and benches shaped like leaves. Birds chirped overhead, and the sound of a nearby fountain added a calm hum to the air. She didn't bring Grace this time. Just herself and the boys. They walked in silence for a while, Vivian letting them set the pace. Micah skipped ahead a few times, distracted by butterflies, while Malachi stayed beside her, watching everything with guarded eyes. She respected that about him. His awareness, his caution. She had once been just like that, distrusting, calculating, waiting for people to prove themselves before letting them close. That's how she survived her own childhood of false smiles and broken promises, and now she saw that same armor in Malachi. When they reached a bench beneath a flowering tree, Vivian sat down and patted the space beside her. "I want to ask you something," she said gently. Both boys turned to her. "If you had the chance to live anywhere in the world, with anything you needed, what would you choose?" It was an open question. Micah answered first without hesitation. "I'd want to go where my brother goes." Vivian smiled softly and looked to Malachi. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I'd choose a place where we don't have to move again. Where people don't lie about staying." His words pierced deeper than she expected. "Not angry, just honest?" Vivian nodded slowly. "I can't promise I'll be perfect," she said. "But I can promise that if you choose us, we will never leave you behind. Never separate you. Never make you feel small." Malachi studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly, not with suspicion but with hope. A flicker of belief. For the first time, she had passed one of his silent tests, and though he didn't say a word, she felt the wall was beginning to crack. By evening, arrangements had been made for the Brooks family to return to their estate in Abuja by private flight. Vivian insisted the boys come along not as guests, but as part of the family. Auntie Lara had signed the temporary guardianship waiver with little resistance. Whether it was guilt, the overwhelming attention, or the promise of a generous financial settlement Nathan had quietly extended, she seemed relieved to step away. Before leaving, she hugged the boys awkwardly and muttered, "Be good, okay?" They nodded, but it didn't sting when she walked out. They had already begun letting go. The estate was nothing short of a dream. a mansion surrounded by lush gardens, a private school on the grounds, live-in staff, and a wing renovated into a nursery suite for baby Grace. The twins were given a room now, a space that was more than just walls and a bed. It had their names on the door. A bookshelf already filled with storybooks, a chalkboard wall, matching beds with navy sheets. Micah gasped when he saw the nightlight shaped like a rocket ship. "Do we sleep here forever?" he asked in awe. Vivian knelt down. "As long as you want." Malachi didn't speak, but his fingers traced the edge of the bookshelf slowly, one book at a time. Nathan watched them both and felt a strange tightness in his chest, an emotion he rarely allowed himself. It wasn't just gratitude. It was love. Budding, surprising, inconvenient love. That night, Vivian tucked both boys in herself, while Grace slept quietly in her bassinet. As she leaned down to kiss Micah's forehead, he whispered, "Thank you for not forgetting us." Vivian swallowed the lump in her throat. Then she turned to Malachi, who lay quietly, wide awake. "Good night, sweetheart," she said softly. He didn't respond, but for the first time he reached out and gently touched her hand. And that was all the answer she needed. The next morning, Nathan stood at the window of his home office, watching the sunrise over the vast garden. The scent of brewed coffee filled the air, but he hadn't taken a sip. He couldn't stop thinking about the twins. He had always seen children as distant creatures, adorable in commercials, manageable at family events, but never something he imagined having in his world. But here he was, feeling completely undone by two small boys with oversized hearts. Vivian walked in holding Grace, who blinked up at her father with sleepy curiosity. "You didn't sleep," she said softly. He turned. "No. I kept thinking they're just kids, but they've already gone through more than most adults." He paused, running a hand down his face. "Do you think we're really what they need?" Vivian walked closer, setting Grace in his arms and resting a hand on his shoulder. "They don't need perfect. They need permanence. We don't need to replace their past, we just need to protect their future." Nathan looked down at Grace, who was yawning. "I never thought I'd say this," he admitted, "but I want them here. For good." Vivian nodded. "So do I." That afternoon she called the boys into the family lounge. They came together as always, Malachi silent and alert, Micah cheerful but cautious. Vivian knelt to their level. "Would you be okay if we called you our sons?" she asked gently. The question hung in the air. Micah's eyes widened. "Like forever?" he whispered. "Yes," Nathan said. "Forever." For a few seconds, neither boy said anything. Then Micah threw his arms around Vivian's neck and nodded against her shoulder. Malachi stood frozen. Then, slowly, he whispered, "Can I still talk to her sometimes? In my head?" Vivian didn't ask who. She just nodded, eyes brimming with tears. "Always." And in that quiet room, without papers or signatures, a new family was sealed not by law, but by love. News crews and media requests didn't take long to find the Brooks estate. Word had spread like wildfire after the airline confirmed the emergency mid-flight delivery, and passengers had posted clips and testimonies online. The world was obsessed with the story, the billionaire's wife who gave birth in the sky, and the orphaned twin boys who helped deliver the baby. Offers came pouring in: documentaries, morning shows, charity events, brand sponsorships. Everyone wanted a piece of the miracle. Vivian refused almost all of them. She issued one quiet statement through a publicist: "This story is not for profit. It's a story of pain, courage, and healing, and it belongs to the boys." Malachi didn't understand what was happening at first, but he noticed the increase in calls, visitors, and whispered conversations behind doors. Micah, on the other hand, had grown excited. "Are we famous now?" he asked one morning, running into the kitchen. "Do we get to be on TV?" Vivian smiled as she chopped fruit. "We're already special. We don't need a camera to tell us that." But Nathan had other plans, quiet, long-term ones. He began speaking with lawyers and adoption consultants, putting together the necessary documents to begin the legal process. No announcements, no press, just action. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the estate and soft music played in the background, the family gathered for dinner, now a routine that felt familiar. Micah told a silly story from their school tour earlier that day, making Grace gurgle with laughter. Malachi, unusually relaxed, smiled too. It wasn't wide or loud, but it was real. Vivian caught Nathan's eye across the table and mouthed one word, home. He nodded. Outside, the world kept watching. But inside that dining room, they were just a family. And for the first time in their short lives, Malachi and Micah no longer wondered when they would be asked to leave. Malachi sat by the window that night long after everyone else had gone to sleep. The moonlight fell across the floor in soft, silver beams, casting faint shadows on the carpet. He held one of the new books Vivian had given them. But he wasn't reading it. His thoughts were elsewhere on his mother. He remembered her voice, the way she hummed songs while cooking, the warmth of her hand holding his, even as she winced through labor with the baby they never got to keep. He remembered holding Micah's hand in the hallway while men in white coats said they were too late. He remembered the silence that followed. Now, in a house filled with soft music, laughter, and new clothes in his wardrobe, he felt something strange creeping in. Guilt. How could he be okay when his mother wasn't here to see it? Would she think he'd forgotten her? That he had moved on too quickly? He wiped his eyes and looked up at the stars. "I still remember," he whispered. "I didn't forget you." Vivian had stepped into the hallway to check on Grace, but paused when she saw him through the slightly open door. She didn't enter right away. Instead, she sat quietly on the floor beside the doorway, giving him space yet still there. Malachi didn't move, but after a few minutes, he said without looking back, "She used to read to us. Every night." Vivian stood and walked in slowly, sitting beside him. "Do you want to read together now?" He nodded once. She picked up the book he had dropped and began to read softly. Her voice wasn't the same as his mother's, but it was steady, gentle, safe. And as the minutes passed, Malachi leaned against her shoulder not because he forgot his mother, but because for the first time, the ghosts didn't haunt. They comforted. And somehow it felt like she was proud of him, proud that he had made it this far. A few days later, Vivian and Nathan invited Malachi and Micah into the home office, only this time, there was no talk of school schedules or house rules. Nathan wore a calm, purposeful expression as he knelt to their level, holding two neatly prepared folders. "Do you remember when we said we wanted you to be part of our family?" he asked. The boys nodded slowly, their hands still slightly sticky from the mangoes they'd eaten after lunch. "Well," he continued, sliding the folders forward, "we spoke to the people who make those things official. And now we'd like to ask if you want to become our sons. Not just in this house, but in name. In every way." Vivian knelt beside him, her voice soft. "You don't have to say yes now. You can take time to think. This isn't just about us, it's about what you want." Micah looked at Malachi, his eyes wide and unsure. It was always Malachi who spoke first when things mattered. Always Malachi who carried the fear they both felt. But today Micah's little voice broke through. "Will our names change?" he asked. "They can," Nathan said, "if you want. Or you can keep your names and just add ours. Whatever makes you feel most like you." Micah nodded slowly, comforted. Malachi didn't speak for several seconds. He stared at the folder with his name typed neatly across the top. His fingers hovered over it. "Will we still be brothers?" he asked. Nathan smiled. "Nothing and no one will ever change that." And then Malachi did something no one expected. He opened the folder. Page by page, he traced the writing with his eyes. At the last page, where his signature was meant to go, he looked up and said, "Can I sign now?" Vivian nodded, her hand over her heart, her voice catching. "Yes, baby, yes you can." And as the pen touched the paper, a chapter of their story, one that began in fear and ended in family, was sealed with the one thing they had been missing all along, belonging. 1 month later, Vivian sat beside a large airplane window with baby Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms, her tiny fingers wrapped around the collar of her blanket. The same airline had invited them for a quiet celebration, a thank you flight, honoring the miracle that had brought the world to tears. The cabin looked familiar, but everything felt different now. Malachi and Micah were seated beside her, each with a window view, this time not in the back row but right at the center first-class seats, the kind their mother could never afford, the kind they never even dreamed of. Vivian reached into her handbag and pulled out 2 matching pins, small silver wings, the kind given to honorary junior pilots. She handed one to each boy. "You earned these," she said. "More than anyone else ever has." Micah beamed as he pinned it to his shirt. Malachi took his more slowly, examining it with thoughtful eyes before placing it neatly over his heart. Nathan, seated across the aisle, gave them both a thumbs up. The flight attendants smiled warmly, some of the same ones from that unforgettable day. As the plane took off, cutting through the clouds once more, Vivian looked at the boys. "Do you remember this moment?" she asked gently. Malachi nodded. "This was where she cried the first time." Micah added, "But now she smiles." They were talking about Vivian, about Grace, about the woman who had once been a stranger and was now simply Mum. Vivian reached for their hands and squeezed them both. For a long moment, the 3 of them just looked out the window. The sky stretched wide and quiet, and with each passing cloud, their past seemed further behind them, not erased, but softened by love, like the glow of the sun breaking through after a storm. And in that cabin, high above the world, they knew the truth. They weren't passengers anymore. They were home. Back on the ground, the flight became headline news again, not because of drama or tragedy, but because of healing. This time, Vivian agreed to one exclusive interview, not for fame or attention, but because she wanted to tell the story right. She brought the boys with her, seated on a calm morning show set with warm lights and soft chairs. Micah swung his legs shyly while Malachi sat up straight, clutching the same book they read together at night. Vivian held Grace in her lap, dressed in soft pink, blinking at the cameras with innocent eyes. The host smiled at them gently and asked the question the world wanted to know. "Why did you do it? You were just kids. Scared. Alone. What made you help her?" Malachi didn't look at the camera. He looked at Vivian. Then he said, "Because we knew how it felt to lose someone." Micah added quietly, "And we didn't want anyone else to feel that." The room went still. Vivian wiped her eyes. "These boys didn't just save my life. They taught me what love looks like when it's pure. They reminded me of everything that really matters." She paused, brushing Grace's cheek. "This is our family now, not because of blood, but because of heart." The interview aired across the country. Donations poured in, not to the Brooks, but to orphanages and children's hospitals in the boys' names. Schools reached out with scholarships. Other children who had lost parents began sending letters, calling the boys heroes. But through all the attention, Malachi and Micah remained grounded. They still helped set the table, still read before bed, still checked to make sure the other had brushed their teeth. And every night before the lights went off, they whispered to each other the same promise they made long ago. "We go together. Always." It was an ordinary Saturday afternoon when the photo was taken, one that would later hang in the Brooks family's hallway, right by the front door. Micah had spilled juice all over his shorts while chasing butterflies. Malachi had just finished a drawing of their late mother, and baby Grace had finally started walking. Vivian, in a moment of quiet joy, called everyone into the garden. "Let's take a picture," she said, holding her phone with one hand and Grace with the other. Nathan set the timer and ran into the frame at the last second, pulling the boys close. In the picture, Micah was laughing with his mouth wide open. Malachi stood beside him, not smiling big, but calm, confident. Vivian was glowing, her arm around both boys, and Grace stood between them all, tiny and wobbly, but perfectly centered. Nathan's hand rested gently on Malachi's shoulder, a proud, protective gesture. The photo wasn't staged. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Later that night, Vivian printed it and placed it into a wooden frame with the inscription, "Brought together by heaven, bonded forever by love." She showed it to the boys just before bed. "We're going to put this by the door," she said. "So whenever you walk out into the world, you remember who you are. And whenever you come home, you remember where you belong." Micah held the frame carefully, tracing everyone's face with his small fingers. "We look like a real family," he whispered. Malachi didn't say anything. He just held the picture a moment longer before handing it back. But before he walked away, he turned to Vivian and said something he'd never said before, not to her, not to anyone. "Good night, Mum. Vivian froze. Then smiled. "Good night, sweetheart." Weeks passed, and the calm routine of family life became the new normal. Malachi and Micah began school at one of the best institutions in the city, an opportunity they'd only ever heard about in whispers. Uniforms crisp, backpacks new, and notebooks without creased pages. Everything felt unfamiliar but right. Vivian packed their lunches herself every morning, scribbling small notes and hiding them between sandwiches. "You are brave," one would say. "You are needed." Another. The boys pretended not to care, but Malachi folded every note neatly and kept them in a tin under his bed. But healing, no matter how sweet, doesn't always silence the past. One afternoon, as Vivian prepared dinner and Grace played with blocks in the living room, a call came through from an unknown number. Nathan answered, thinking it was another media inquiry. But the voice on the other end introduced himself as Daniel Ikenner, a man claiming to be the boys' estranged uncle, the one who never came for them. His voice was smooth but nervous. "I heard what happened. I want to see them." Nathan's jaw tightened. "You had your chance." "I didn't know. I was abroad. I thought they were being looked after until I saw the interview. They're my sister's boys. I deserve a conversation." Nathan didn't answer right away. After the call ended, he relayed everything to Vivian. She sat quietly, her brow furrowed, not with fear but concern. "Do we tell them?" she asked. "Do we let them decide?" That night, Vivian sat the boys down, explaining everything gently. Malachi's face changed, something ancient passed over his young features. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. Micah, though, whispered, "Why now? Why not when we needed him?" Vivian held them both and said, "You don't owe anyone anything. But if you want answers, we'll be right beside you." And just like that, the past knocked gently on the future's door, asking to be heard. The meeting was arranged quietly, with no media or attention, just a small cafe near the city's edge, far from the buzz of the estate. Nathan insisted on being present, and Vivian came too, but stayed at a distance, watching from outside through the tinted glass. Malachi and Micah sat at a corner table, stiff and silent, dressed in matching denim jackets and sneakers they had chosen themselves. They looked older than their years in that moment, not just in appearance, but in posture, in the way they braced for whatever was coming. Daniel arrived exactly on time, a man in his early 40s with tired eyes and the nervous energy of someone who knew he was far too late. He approached the table slowly, unsure if a hug or handshake was appropriate. The boys offered neither. He sat down. "You've grown," he said softly, trying to smile. "You probably don't remember me." Silence. Micah fidgeted, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Malachi stared straight ahead, his face blank but his jaw tight. "I was your mother's brother," Daniel continued. "I didn't know how bad things had gotten after she passed. I didn't know where you were." Malachi finally spoke, his voice low but sharp. "You knew she was sick. You knew we had no one." Daniel flinched. "I didn't have anything to offer then. I wasn't ready to be a parent. But I'm here now if you want to talk, if you have questions." Micah looked up, tears brimming. "We waited. We cried. We begged God every night for someone to come." Daniel's eyes filled. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "More than I can say." Nathan stepped forward slightly, just in case, but he didn't interrupt. This wasn't his story. Malachi looked Daniel dead in the eyes. "We don't hate you, but we're not your responsibility anymore." And then he stood, gently taking Micah's hand. "We have a family now, one that showed up when it mattered." Weeks turned into months, and the boys adjusted with grace. Their story slowly faded from the headlines, replaced by newer tragedies and triumphs, but in their home, the memory of that flight lived on in the most beautiful ways. Vivian had commissioned a mural on the hallway wall, a soft watercolor painting of clouds, with a golden plane soaring through it. Beneath it were 5 names: Vivian, Nathan, Grace, Malachi, Micah. No titles, no separations, just family. One afternoon, the family visited a children's hospital for a quiet outreach Vivian had planned. The staff had dedicated a new reading room in the boys' honor. Above the door hung a plaque. "The Grace Room, inspired by courage, built on love. Inside, shelves overflowed with books. The first one displayed was authored by Vivian herself, The Flight That Found Us, a story written not for profit, but for children who felt lost, unloved, forgotten. It ended with the line, "Sometimes the best families are the ones built in midair." Back home that evening, Micah helped feed Grace her evening puree, while Malachi watered the small rose plant they had named after their mother. Vivian stood in the doorway, watching with a soft, full heart. She joined them, wrapping an arm around each boy's shoulder. "Tomorrow," she said, "we go to court to make everything official." The boys nodded. No fear, no hesitation, just quiet joy. The next morning, dressed in little suits and holding her hand, they entered the courtroom together. Nathan stood tall beside them. Grace clapped from her stroller. When the judge asked Malachi, "Do you understand what this means?" he replied simply, "It means we're not alone anymore." The gavel struck. The names were changed. The papers signed. And as they walked out of the courtroom into the sunlight, the world didn't applaud, but they didn't need it to. They had already been seen, already been chosen. They were no longer passengers in anyone else's story. They were home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button, share with someone who needs hope, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. See you in the next one.